Hello and welcome to my sports storytelling podcast. I am your host, Winn Williams. This episode will be on the Battle of the Sexes between Billie Jean King and Bobby Riggs. If you'd like to read about the Battle of the Sexes with some visuals, I encourage you to follow the link in the description to a Sutori, which is a different storytelling medium, and you can take this story in that way. Now, I might be a little excited or biased about this match because I grew up loving to watch and play tennis. To me, tennis is fantastic because it doesn't matter who is on the other side of the net, gender, age, or any other factor. It's just, in that moment, the players are equal, and the winner comes out on top. And I lost and won a lot of tennis. What draws me to this match is because Billie Jean King and Bobby Riggs, two professionals, all-time greats, would never normally play each other. Riggs was 55 and a former number one, and King was a 29-year-old and really towards the peak of her game, or a few years off the peak of her game, right in the middle of her career, and a top tennis talent in the world, even at that time. On the court, for a short time, they were seen as equals until the victor was crowned. Another thing that really draws me to this story is because it really symbolizes the beginning of a fight for equality for pay in sports. Even today, 40 years removed from this event, the pay gap in sports is astronomical. You can look at the WNBA with players making just under $100,000 a season, whereas the top men in the NBA make over $30 million. With a few clicks online, you can find pay gaps in soccer, hockey, rugby, and most other sports where men dominate the spotlight and profit from it. However, that's not so evident in tennis today. You can see in 1973, the first of the tennis tournaments, major tennis tournaments, equalized pay, which was the U.S. Open. The Battle of the Sexes didn't really have a bearing on the decisions made as far as how athletes should be paid. However, it does coincide nicely at that same time period, which I see it as a unique symbol for the start of equal pay for athletes and really sets the stage for years to come. The first key player of the Battle of the Sexes is Bobby Riggs. Bobby Riggs was a professional men's tennis player from California who was widely successful, was known for winning the Triple Crown at Wimbledon and 3 men's single Grand Slam titles, as well as 2 runner-ups. Riggs' professional career was from 1941 to 1959, and his career, however, in the middle was interrupted by World War II, where he served in the military. Riggs was accepted into the International Tennis Hall of Fame in 1967, 6 years before the Battle of the Sexes would take place. The other competitor was Billie Jean King. King was was born to a lower middle class family in California and had some trouble making it to the pros due to the lack of sponsors for women's tournaments and not being able to afford to travel to competitions without them. King would go on to win 12 women's singles Grand Slams, as well as 27 other major titles in singles and doubles. This is an astronomical achievement. To win 39 Grand Slams in major tournaments during a career for men or women is absolutely mind-boggling and an incredible feat. To fully understand how massive the Battle of the Sexes was at the time, you have to take a fair amount of things into context. The catalyst for the event was in late 1972 when Bobby Riggs stated that he could beat any female tennis player and that men were overall superior on the court. He challenged Billie Jean King to a public match, and King declined. King, being 29 and really only halfway through her career, didn't really make sense because Bobby was well into his 50s. King was also doing a lot of other things, advocating off the court for equal winnings between male and female tennis players. King championed Title IX and was one of the main faces of the equality movement. Just that year prior to the at a tournament in Rome, King won $600 for a first place victory, whereas the male counterpart won $3,500. That is about a 580% pay difference, not including the amount of sponsorships that were given out during that, which for King paled in comparison to most other male players. So she was pretty busy, and it didn't make sense for her to play against Riggs, because if she lost, it would be a great embarrassment and wouldn't really fit the mold of what she was trying to do. Whereas if she won, then she would be heralded as a champion. However, the risk was just too great and the reward was too small. Although King at the time was a former world number one, there was another women's tennis star by the name of Margaret Court that was at the top of women's tennis, working her way towards number one and would get it within the year. Court accepted Riggs' challenge and played on Mother's Day in 1973. This became known as the Mother's Day Massacre, as Riggs defeated Court in straight sets of 6-2, 6-1. Court was a baseline player, and Riggs used this to his advantage by baiting her forward and then lobbing shots to the back, running around and tiring her out. It was only after this match that Billie Jean King accepted Bobby Riggs' challenge to the Battle of the Sexes, which the match was set to late September after the finals of that 1973 U.S. Open. In the months leading up to the Battle of the Sexes, there were several strides made for women's equality in tennis thanks to Billie Jean King. Firstly, King started securing sponsorships for women's tennis, such as Virginia Slims. Virginia Slims was a female-based cigarette company that sold tobacco products specifically made for women that were smaller, more dainty, which doesn't really... The fact that products like cigarettes could be gendered is somewhat foreign to us now in 2019, where that sort of thing isn't really marketed anymore. Later, King would say that she wished she had gotten a different sponsor due to the adverse health effects of cigarettes, but she was thankful that the company did some good. With more sponsors approaching women's tennis, King, alongside other athletes, threatening to boycott the U.S. Open, the U.S. Tennis Association caved in and guaranteed equal winning purses for both men's and women's tennis, being the first major tournament and Grand Slam to equalize pay in 1973. Just ironically enough, the U.S. Women's Open singles tournament was won none other by Margaret Court, who played Riggs earlier that year in the Mother's Day Massacre. But she did win equal winnings, and the U.S. Open has continued to give equal winnings to men and women since then. During the duration, other things leading up to the Battle of the Sexes was the press conferences and media attention brought to the match. The location was set at the Astrodome in Houston with a winner-take-all prize of $100,000. Now, this was far and above, like 4 times the amount that one would be paid at a normal tournament for this single match. So it brought in a lot of media attention. Riggs, leading up to that, made degrading and sexist remarks towards women, whereas Billie Jean King appeared more calm and calculated, talking about them taking the match more seriously than her counterpart, as it seemed during those press conferences. This was apparent up to the match, where Riggs wore a jacket from his sponsor Sugar Daddy Candies up until the second game of the match, when he was losing. He took off the jacket for more mobility, he said. Billie Jean King won the Battle of the Sexes in 3 straight sets of 6-4, 6-3, and 6-3. After the match, Bobby Riggs admitted defeat, saying that King was just too quick and powerful from the service line. Critics of the match were quick to point out about the age difference between Riggs and King of about over 20 years. It was also important to remember the amount of pomp and circumstance surrounding the event. This was an exhibition match, for the most part, was symbolic. It was a chance for Riggs to be in the spotlight again out of his retirement, and for Riggs, it was a symbolic point proving that men and women should be equal on the court. With the women's movement in full swing and the equalization of pay for the U.S. Open both happening in the past month, King furthered that statement that men and women should be paid equally in all forms that day. The Battle of the Sexes became a symbol for the equalization of pay in sports, due in part to a few factors. Firstly, it was King that played. Since King was already deeply involved in the women's movement and was fighting for equal pay, the match made sense now after Margaret Court losing for what she was trying to accomplish. With Court being the number one and then losing to Riggs, it was Billie Jean King that acted as somewhat of an avenger for her and proving that they should be on the same court. Secondly, the media spectacle was absolutely massive. The Astrodome was sold out. The event was televised, and the match dominated headlines, partly due to the players that were involved, and also due to the $100,000 that was on the line. Finally, and most importantly, this match is remembered because Billie Jean King won. If Bobby Riggs had won the Battle of the Sexes, it would have fallen into obscurity and wouldn't be as well known, much like the Mother's Day Massacre with Margaret Court. To me, however, this match really stands as a symbol of the beginning of the equalization of pay, or at least the fight for the equalization of pay for men's and women's sports. Now, this, the topic of equalization of pay in women's sports has a lot to do with money. And there's a lot going on today where people are pointing to some tournaments or sports not being as profitable as others, and that has to do somewhat with the sponsors that are willing to go in and the media attention that is given. You can look to tennis as a model to show that both sides, men's and women's tennis, are marketed somewhat equally. The tournaments are broadcasted very close to equally, and the pay is equal. It is not from a lack of talent or skill on either side of the gender line. It is mostly due to the viewership and how accessible that viewership is. I would like to thank you all for listening to this podcast. Once again, my name is Winn Williams. If you're interested in learning more about the Battle of the Sexes, Bobby Riggs, or Billie Jean King, I implore you to go and do your own research. However, I do have some sources in my description, as well as a Sutori for you to look at some images of King and Riggs, as well as view some clips from the Battle of the Sexes and the Mother's Day Massacre. Thank you all for listening. I hope you have a very nice day.